A Tale in 7 Stories. First story, which has to do with a mirror and its fragments. Now then, we will begin. When the story is done, you shall know a great deal more than you do know. He was a terribly bad hobgoblin, a goblin of the very wickedest sort, and in fact, he was the devil himself. One day the devil was in a very good humour because he had just finished a mirror which had this peculiar power. Everything good and beautiful that was reflected in it seemed to dwindle to almost nothing at all, while everything that was worthless and ugly became most conspicuous and even uglier than ever. In this mirror, the loveliest landscapes looked like boiled spinach, and the very best people became hideous, or stood on their heads and had no stomachs. Their faces were distorted beyond any recognition, and if a person had a freckle, it was sure to spread until it covered both nose and mouth. "That's very funny," said the devil. If a good, pious thought passed through anyone's mind, it showed in the mirror as a carnal grin, and the devil laughed aloud at his ingenious invention. All those who went to the hobgoblin's school, for he had a school of his own, told everyone that a miracle had come to pass. Now, they asserted, for the very first time, you could see how the world and its people really looked. They scurried about with the mirror until there was not a person alive nor a land on earth that had not been distorted. Then they wanted to fly up to heaven itself, to scoff at the angels and our Lord. The higher they flew with the mirror, the wider it grinned. They could hardly manage to hold it. Higher they flew, and higher still, nearer to heaven and the angels. Then the grinning mirror trembled with such violence that it slipped from their hands and fell to the earth, where it shattered into hundreds of millions of billions of bits, or perhaps even more. And now it caused more trouble than it did before it was broken, because some of the fragments were smaller than a grain of sand, and these went flying throughout the wide world. Once they got in people's eyes, they would stay there. These bits of glass distorted everything that people saw, and made them see only the bad side of things, for every little bit of glass kept the same power that the whole mirror had possessed. A few people even got a glass splinter in their hearts, and that was a terrible thing, for it turned their hearts into lumps of ice. Some of the fragments were so large that they were used as window panes, but not the kind of window through which you should look at your friends. Other pieces were made into spectacles, and evil things came to pass when people put them on to see clearly and to see justice done. The fiend was so tickled by it all that he laughed till his sides were sore. But fine bits of the glass are still flying through the air, and now you shall hear what happened. Second story. A little boy and a little girl. In the big city, it was so crowded with houses and people that few found room for even a small garden, and most people had to be content with a flower pot. But 2 poor children who lived there managed to have a garden that was a little bigger than a flower pot. These children were not brother and sister, but they loved each other just as much as if they had been. Their parents lived close to one another in the garrets of 2 adjoining houses, where the roofs met and where the rain gutter ran between the 2 houses. Their 2 small windows faced each other. One had only to step across the rain gutter to go from window to window. In these windows the parents had a large box where they planted vegetables for their use, and a little rose bush too. Each box had a bush which thrived to perfection. Then, it occurred to the parents to put these boxes across the gutter, where they very nearly reached from one window to the other and looked exactly like two walls of flowers. The pea plants hung down over the boxes, and the rose bushes threw out long sprays that framed the windows and bent over towards each other. It was almost like a little triumphal arch of greenery and flowers. The boxes were very high, and the children knew that they were not to climb about on them. But they were often allowed to take their little stools out on the roof under the roses, where they had a wonderful time playing together. Winter, of course, put an end to this pleasure. The windows often frosted over completely, but they would heat copper pennies on the stove and press these hot coins against the frost-coated glass. Then they had the finest of peepholes, as round as a ring, and behind them appeared a bright, friendly eye, one at each window. It was the little boy and the little girl who peeped out. His name was Kay, and hers was Gerda. With one skip, they could join each other in summer. But to visit together in the winter time, they had to go all the way downstairs in one house and climb all the way upstairs in the other. Outside, the snow was whirling. "See, the white bees swarming," the old grandmother said. "Do they have a queen bee too?" the little boy asked, for he knew that real bees have one. "Yes, indeed they do," the grandmother said. "She flies in the thick of the swarm. She is the biggest bee of all, and can never stay quietly on the earth, but goes back again to the dark clouds. Many a wintry night she flies through the streets and peers in through the windows. Then they freeze over in a strange fashion, as if they were covered with flowers." "Oh yes, we've seen that," both the children said. And so they knew it was true. "Can the Snow Queen come in here?" the little girl asked. "Well, let her come," cried the boy. "I would put her on a hot stove and melt her." But grandmother stroked his head and told them other stories. That evening, when little Kay was at home and half ready for bed, he climbed on the chair by the window and looked out through the little peephole. A few snowflakes were falling, and the largest flake of all alighted on the edge of one of the flower boxes. This flake grew bigger and bigger until at last it turned into a woman who was dressed in the finest white gauze, which looked as if it had been made from millions of star-shaped flakes. She was beautiful, and she was graceful, but she was ice shining, glittering ice. She was alive, for all that, and her eyes sparkled like two bright stars, but in them there was neither rest nor peace. She nodded toward the window and beckoned with her hand. The little boy was frightened, and as he jumped down from the chair, it seemed to him that a huge bird flew past the window. The next day was clear and cold. Then the snow thawed and springtime came. The sun shone, the green grass sprouted, swallows made their nests, windows were thrown open, and once again the children played in their little roof garden high up in the rain gutter on top of the house. That summer the roses bloomed their splendid best. The little girl had learned a hymn in which there was a line about roses that reminded her of their own flowers. She sang it to the little boy, and he sang it with her. "Where roses bloom so sweetly in the vale, there shall you find the Christ child without fail." The children held each other by the hand, kissed the roses, looked up at the Lord's clear sunshine, and spoke to it as if the Christ child were there. What glorious summer days those were, and how beautiful it was out under those fragrant rose bushes, which seemed as if they would never stop blooming. Kay and Gerda were looking at a picture book of birds and beasts one day, and it was then, just as the clock in the church tower was striking 5, that Kay cried, "Oh, something hurt my heart, and now I've got something in my eye." The little girl put her arm around his neck, and he blinked his eye. No, she couldn't see anything in it. "I think it's gone," he said, but it was not gone. It was one of those splinters of glass from the magic mirror. You remember that goblin's mirror, the one which made everything great and good that was reflected in it appear small and ugly, but which magnified all evil things until each blemish loomed large. Poor Kay! A fragment had pierced his heart as well, and soon it would turn into a lump of ice. The pain had stopped, but the glass was still there. "Why should you be crying?" he asked. "It makes you look so ugly. There's nothing the matter with me." And suddenly he took it into his head to say, "Oh, that rose is all worm-eaten, and look, this one is crooked. And these roses, they are just as ugly as they can be. They look like the boxes they grow in." He gave the boxes a kick and broke off both of the roses. "Kay, what are you doing?" the little girl cried. When he saw how it upset her, he broke off another rose, and then leaped home through his own window, leaving dear little Gerda all alone. Afterwards, when she brought out her picture book, he said it was fit only for babies in the cradle. And whenever grandmother told stories, he always broke in with a "but." If he could manage it, he would steal behind her, perch a pair of spectacles on his nose, and imitate her. He did this so cleverly that it made everybody laugh, and before long he could mimic the walk and the talk of everyone who lived on that street. Everything that was odd or ugly about them, Kay could mimic so well that people said, "That boy has surely got a good head on him." But it was the glass in his eye and the glass in his heart that made him tease even little Gerda, who loved him with all her soul. Now his games were very different from what they used to be. They became more sensible. When the snow was flying about one wintry day, he brought a large magnifying glass out of doors and spread the tail of his blue coat to let the snowflakes fall on it. "Now look through the glass," he told Gerda. Each snowflake seemed much larger and looked like a magnificent flower or a 10-pointed star. It was marvellous to look at. "Look how artistic," said Kay. "They are much more interesting to look at than real flowers, for they are absolutely perfect. There isn't a flaw in them until they start melting." A little while later, Kay came down with his big gloves on his hands and his sled on his back. Right in Gerda's ear he bawled out, "I've been given permission to play in the big square where the other boys are," and away he ran. In the square, some of the more adventuresome boys would tie their little sleds on behind the farmers' carts to be pulled along for quite a distance. It was wonderful sport. While the fun was at its height, a big sleigh drove up. It was painted entirely white, and the driver wore a white, shaggy fur cloak and a white, shaggy cap. As the sleigh drove twice around the square, Kay quickly hooked his little sled behind it, and down the street they went, faster and faster. The driver turned around in a friendly fashion and nodded to Kay, just as if they were old acquaintances. Every time Kay started to unfasten his little sleigh, its driver nodded again, and Kay held on, even when they drove right through the town gate. Then the snow began to fall so fast that the boy could not see his hands in front of him as they sped on. He suddenly let go the slack of the rope in his hands in order to get loose from the big sleigh, but it did no good. His little sled was tied on securely, and they went like the wind. He gave a loud shout, but nobody heard him. The snow whirled and the sleigh flew along. Every now and then it gave a jump, as if it were clearing hedges and ditches. The boy was terror-stricken. He tried to say his prayers, but all he could remember was his multiplication tables. The snowflakes got bigger and bigger until they looked like big white hens. All of a sudden, the curtain of snow parted, and the big sleigh stopped, and the driver stood up. The fur coat and the cap were made of snow, and it was a woman, tall and slender and blinding white. She was the Snow Queen herself. "We have made good time," she said. "Is it possible that you tremble from cold? Crawl under my bear coat." She took him up in the sleigh beside her, and as she wrapped the fur about him, he felt as if he were sinking into a snowdrift. "Are you still cold?" she asked, and kissed him on the forehead. Brrr. That kiss was colder than ice. He felt it right down to his heart, half of which was already an icy lump. He felt as if he were dying, but only for a moment. Then he felt quite comfortable and no longer noticed the cold. "My sled, don't forget my sled." It was the only thing he thought of. They tied it to one of the white hens, which flew along after them with the sled on its back. The Snow Queen kissed Kay once more, and then he forgot little Gerda and grandmother and all the others at home. "You won't get any more kisses now," she said, "or else I should kiss you to death." Kay looked at her. She was so beautiful. A cleverer and prettier face he could not imagine. She no longer seemed to be made of ice, as she had seemed when she sat outside his window and beckoned him. In his eyes she was perfect, and she was not at all afraid. He told her how he could do mental arithmetic, even with fractions, and that he knew the size and the population of all the countries. She kept on smiling, and he began to be afraid that he did not know as much as he thought he did. He looked up at the great big space overhead as she flew with him high on the black clouds, while the storm whistled and roared as if it was singing old ballads. They flew over forests and lakes, over many a land and sea. Below them the wind blew cold, wolves howled, and black crows screamed as they skimmed across the glittering snow. But up above the moon shone bright and large, and on it Kay fixed his eyes throughout that long, long winter night. By day he slept at the feet of the Snow Queen. The flower garden of the woman skilled in magic. How did little Gerda get along when Kay did not come back? Where could he be? Nobody knew. All that the boys could say was that they had seen him hitch his little sled to a fine big sleigh which had driven down the street and out through the town gate. Nobody knew what had become of Kay, Many tears were shed, and little Gerda sobbed hardest of all. People said that he was dead, that he must have been drowned in the river not far from town. Ah, how gloomy those long winter days were. But spring and its warm sunshine came at last. Kay is dead and gone, little Gerda said. I don't believe it, said the sunshine. He's dead and gone, she said to the swallows. We don't believe it, they sang. Finally, little Gerda began to disbelieve it too. One morning she said to herself, I'll put on my new red shoes, the ones Kay has never seen, and I'll go down by the river to ask about him. It was very early in the morning. She kissed her old grandmother, who was still asleep, put on her red shoes, and all by herself she hurried out through the town gate and down to the river. Is it true that you have taken my own little playmate? I'll give you my red shoes if you will bring him back to me. It seemed to her that the waves nodded very strangely. So she took off her red shoes that were her dearest possession and threw them into the river. But they fell near the shore, and the little waves washed them right back to her. It seemed that the river could not take her dearest possession, because it did not have little Kay. However, she was afraid that she had not thrown them far enough, so she clambered into a boat that lay among the reeds, walked to the end of it, and threw her shoes out into the water again. But the boat was not tied, and her movements made it drift away from the bank. She realized this and tried to get ashore, but by the time she reached the other end of the boat, it was already more than a yard from the bank, and it was fast gaining speed. Little Gerda was so frightened that she began to cry, and no one was there to hear her except the sparrows. They could not carry her to land, but they flew along the shore twittering, "We are here, here we are," as if to comfort her. The boat drifted swiftly down the stream, and Gerda sat there quite still in her stocking feet. Her little red shoes floated along behind, but they could not catch up with her because the boat was gathering headway. It was very pretty on both sides of the river, where the flowers were lovely, the trees were old, and the hillsides afforded pasture for cattle and sheep. But not one single person did Gerda see. Perhaps the river will take me to little Kay, she thought, and that made her feel more cheerful. She stood up and watched the lovely green banks for hour after hour. Then she came to a large cherry orchard, in which there was a little house with strange red and blue windows. It had a thatched roof, and outside it stood 2 wooden soldiers who presented arms to everyone who sailed past. Gerda thought they were alive and called out to them, but of course they did not answer her. She drifted quite close to them as the current drove the boat toward the bank. Gerda called even louder, and an old woman came out of the house. She leaned on a crooked stick. She had on a big sun hat, and on it were painted the most glorious flowers. "You poor little child," the old woman exclaimed. "However did you get lost on this big swift river, and however did you drift so far into the great wide world?" The old woman waded right into the water, caught hold of the boat with her crooked stick, pulled it in to shore, and lifted little Gerda out of it. Gerda was very glad to be on dry land again, but she felt a little afraid of this strange old woman who said to her, "Come and tell me who you are and how you got here." Gerda told her all about it. The woman shook her head and said, And when Gerda had told her everything, and asked if she hadn't seen little Kay, the woman said he had not yet come by, but that he might be along any day now. And she told Gerda not to take it so to heart, but to taste her cherries and to look at her flowers. These were more beautiful than any picture book, and each one had a story to tell. Then she led Gerda by the hand into her little house, and the old woman locked the door. The windows were placed high up on the walls, and through their red, blue and yellow panes, the sunlight streamed in a strange mixture of all the colours there are. But on the table were the most delicious cherries, and Gerda, who was no longer afraid, ate as many as she liked. While she was eating them, the old woman combed her hair with a golden comb. Gerda's pretty hair fell in shining yellow ringlets on either side of a friendly little face that was round and blooming as a rose. "I've so often wished for a dear little girl like you," the old woman told her. "Now you'll see how well the two of us will get along." While her hair was being combed, Gerda gradually forgot all about Kay, for the old woman was skilled in magic. But she was not a wicked witch. She only dabbled in magic to amuse herself, but she wanted very much to keep little Gerda. So she went out into her garden and pointed her crooked stick at all the rose bushes. In the full bloom of their beauty, all of them sank down into the black earth, without leaving a single trace behind. The old woman was afraid that if Gerda saw them, they would remind her so strongly of her own roses and of little Kay that she would run away again. Then Gerda was led into the flower garden. How fragrant and lovely it was! Every known flower of every season was there in full bloom. No picture book was ever so pretty and gay. Gerda jumped for joy and played in the garden until the sun went down behind the tall cherry trees. Then she was tucked into a beautiful bed under the red silk coverlet quilted with blue violets. There she slept, and there she dreamed as gloriously as any queen on her wedding day. The next morning she went out into the warm sunshine to play with the flowers, and this she did for many a day. Gerda knew every flower by heart, and plentiful though they were, she always felt that there was one missing, but which one she didn't quite know. One day she sat looking at the old woman's sun hat, and the prettiest of all the flowers painted on it was a rose. The old woman had forgotten this rose on her hat when she made the real roses disappear in the earth. But that's just the sort of thing that happens when one doesn't stop to think. "Why aren't there any roses here?" said Gerda. She rushed out among the flower beds, and she looked, but there wasn't a rose to be seen. Then she sat down and cried, but her hot tears fell on the very spot where a rose bush had sunk into the ground, and when her warm tears moistened the earth, the bush sprang up again, as full of blossoms as when it disappeared. Gerda hugged it and kissed the roses. She remembered her own pretty roses and thought of little Kay. "Oh, how long I've been delayed," the little girl said. "I should have been looking for Kay. Don't you know where he is?" she asked the roses. "Do you think that he is dead and gone?" "He isn't dead," the roses told her. "We have been down in the earth where the dead people are, but Kay is not there." "Thank you," said little Gerda, who went to all the other flowers, put her lips near them, and asked, "Do you know where little Kay is?" But every flower stood in the sun and dreamed its own fairy tale or its story. Though Gerda listened to many, many of them, not one of the flowers knew anything about Kay. What did the tiger lily say? "Do you hear the drum? Boom, boom." It was only 2 notes, always boom, boom. Hear the women wail, hear the priests chant. The Hindu woman in her long red robe stands on the funeral pyre. The flames rise around her and her dead husband. But the Hindu woman is thinking of that living man in the crowd around them. She is thinking of him whose eyes are burning hotter than the flames, of him whose fiery glances have pierced her heart more deeply than these flames that soon will burn her body to ashes. Can the flame of the heart die in the flame of the funeral pyre? I don't understand that at all, little Gerda said. That's my fairy tale, said the lily. What did the trumpet flower say? An ancient castle rises high from a narrow path in the mountains. The thick ivy grows leaf upon leaf where it climbs to the balcony. There stands a beautiful maiden. She leans out over a balustrade to look down the path. No rose on its stem is as graceful as she, nor is any apple blossom in the breeze so light. Hear the rustle of her silk gown saying, "Will he ever come?" Do you mean Kay? Little Gerda asked. I am talking about my story, my own dream, the trumpet flower replied. What did the little snowdrop say? Between the trees, a board hangs by 2 ropes. It is a swing. 2 pretty little girls with frocks as white as snow and long green ribbons fluttering from their hats are swinging. Their brother, who is bigger than they are, stands behind them on the swing, with his arms around the ropes to hold himself. In one hand he has a little cup, and in the other a clay pipe. He is blowing soap bubbles, and as the swing flies, the bubbles float off in all their changing colours. The last bubble is still clinging to the bowl of his pipe and fluttering in the air as the swing sweeps to and fro. A little black dog, light as a bubble, is standing on his hind legs and trying to get up in the swing, but it does not stop. High and low the swing flies until the dog loses his balance, barks and loses his temper. They tease him and the bubble bursts. A swinging board pictured in a bubble before it broke. That is my story. It may be a very pretty story, but you told it very sadly, and you didn't mention Kay at all. What did the hyacinth say? There were 3 sisters, quite transparent and very fair. One wore a red dress, the second wore a blue one, and the third went all in white. Hand in hand, they danced in the clear moonlight beside a calm lake. They were not elven folk. They were human beings. The air was sweet, and the sisters disappeared into the forest. The fragrance of the air grew sweeter. 3 coffins in which lie the 3 sisters glide out of the forest and across the lake. The fireflies hover above them like little flickering lights, and the dancing sisters sleeping, or are they dead? The fragrance of the flowers says they are dead, and the evening bell tolls for their funeral. You are making me very unhappy, little Gerda said. Your fragrance is so strong that I cannot help thinking of those dead sisters. Oh, could little Kay really be dead? The roses have been down under the ground, and they say no. Ding dong, tolled the hyacinth bells. We do not toll for little Kay. We do not know him. We are simply singing our song, the only song we know. And Gerda went on to the buttercup that shone among its glossy green leaves. You are like a bright little sun, said Gerda. Tell me, do you know where I can find my playmate? And the buttercup shone brightly as it looked up at Gerda. But what sort of song would a buttercup sing? It certainly wouldn't be about Kay. In a small courtyard, God's sun was shining brightly on the very first day of spring. Its beams glanced along the white wall of the house next door, and close by grew the first yellow flowers of spring, shining like gold in the warm sunlight. An old grandmother was sitting outside in her chair. Her granddaughter, a poor but very pretty maidservant, had just come home for a little visit. She kissed her grandmother, and there was gold, a heart full of gold in that kiss. Gold on her lips, gold in her dreams, and gold above in the morning beams. "There, I've told you my little story," said the buttercup. "Oh, my poor old grandmother," said Gerda. "She will miss me so. She must be grieving for me as much as she did for little Kay. But I'll soon go home again, and I'll bring Kay with me. There's no use asking the flowers about him. They don't know anything except their own songs, and they haven't any news for me." Then she tucked up her little skirts so that she could run away faster. But the narcissus tapped against her leg as she was jumping over it. So she stopped and leaned over the tall flower. "Perhaps you have something to tell me," she said. "What did the narcissus say?" "I can see myself. I can see myself. Oh, how sweet is my own fragrance. Up in the narrow garret there is a little dancer, half dressed. First, she stands on one leg. Then she stands on both and kicks her heels at the whole world. She is an illusion of the stage. She pours water from the teapot over a piece of cloth she is holding. It is her bodice. Cleanliness is such a virtue. Her white dress hangs from a hook. It too has been washed in the teapot and dried on the roof. She puts it on and ties a saffron scarf around her neck to make the dress seem whiter. Point your toes. See how straight she balances on that single stem. I can see myself. I can see myself." "I'm not interested," said Gerda. "What a thing to tell me about." She ran to the edge of the garden, and though the gate was fastened, she worked the rusty latch till it gave way, and the gate flew open. Little Gerda scampered out into the wide world in her bare feet. She looked back 3 times, but nobody came after her. At last she could run no further, and she sat down to rest on a big stone, and when she looked up she saw that summer had gone by, and it was late in the fall. She could never have guessed it inside the beautiful garden, where the sun was always shining, and the flowers of every season were always in full bloom. "Gracious, how long I've dallied," Gerda said. "Fall is already here. I can't rest any longer." She got up to run on, but how footsore and tired she was, and how cold and bleak everything around her looked. The long leaves of the willow tree had turned quite yellow, and the damp puffs of mist dropped from them like drops of water. One leaf after another fell to the ground. Only the blackthorn still bore fruit, and its fruit was so sour that it set your teeth on edge. Oh, how dreary and grey the wide world looked.